There was only one thing missing from the accident report. No one recognized that voice. Until the pilot heard the last words coming from the black box. Morning hadn't yet dawned, but the base was already awake. The coldness of the runway concrete hit the soles of their feet. The wind carried a scent of metal and oil. The metallic hum of the jets was steady and cold, like the distant notes of a flute. People flowed with the discipline hidden in the folds of their uniforms, each person taking their own task. In such places, emotions are fleeting. Orders are immediate. A figure walked slowly along the edge of the runway. Edward Haynes. His faded blue overalls, worn gloves, the lines on his forehead echoed with the voice of years. A rusty key in one hand, his notebook in the other. Some called him old. Others never mentioned his name, but Edward's ears were trained to pick up on details a pilot might miss. The whisper of metal, the sway of bearings, the slightest whine of a shaft. Planes talk, he'd say. Only those who listen faithfully understand. Word had spread that a new face was on the base. Captain Ryan Cole, a young, sharp-edged pilot, quickly promoted, highly confident. Looking back at his career, you saw a flawless line. Few mistakes, many pressures. Ryan's credo was clear. Date, numbers, procedure, emotions had no place. When he entered the briefing room, his words sounded pre-programmed. Error means death, he declared. His words hardened the atmosphere in the room. Edward was in the back row, waving his notebook around, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Ryan's posture made him uncomfortable. The slight frown on his brow spoke of youthful arrogance. When the conversation ended, Ryan turned to Edward and asked, "Mr. Haynes, are you still active?" Without looking up, Edward said softly, "If the planes are still flying, I'm on duty." Ryan replied with a short, uninhibited smile, "I hope they're not flying at your speed." Some laughed. Some eyes saw something dark. Edward merely tilted his head, and something clicked behind his ear, a warning from the past, locked on its target. As the day wore on, the runway became busier. Preparations for the F-19C test flight proceeded meticulously. Ryan's tasks were lengthy, his plans precise. Maneuvers, loading, sensor calibrations. Everything was clear on paper, but the portable vibrometer in Edward's hand showed a small but regular deviation, a millisecond long, repeating harmonic in the third engine unit. Most technicians dismissed it as noise, but Edward's ears could tell the fine line between noise and disaster. "Show me this data," the young technician said from above. "The sensor calibration is complete. The software is at fault." Edward switched off the device and stared at the technician. "The sensor doesn't make mistakes, son. Who trained you?" The young man drew back with wounded pride. Edward pulled his notebook from his pocket and sprang into action. Nothing was more natural than action. He had known the language of metal for years. Edward came to him as Ryan completed his cockpit preparations. His voice was low, but his words were decisive. "Captain, there's a slight vibration on engine 3. We'd better take it apart and have a look." Without even looking up, Ryan said, "The data is clean. We're not dwelling on the past." Edward paused for a moment, drawing lines in his notebook. "Data can be fallible. You have to listen," he murmured. Ryan said in a sarcastic tone, "Last flight day, Mr. Haynes. Modern warfare is won by measurement," Edward added firmly, calmly. "Don't take off without checking the engine." The wind picked up the word, carrying it along. The captain's ears were blocked. The cockpit closed. The wing creaked. That day's wind whispered something different. Edward felt it, a tightness in his chest. A memory from the past came back. Once upon a time, a young team of technicians had ignored the same warning again. The result was the bitterest slice of cake. Edward still carried the shadow of that pain. The flight hours progressed as planned. Ryan radioed to the tower. "Falcon 9, takeoff complete, engine stable." At the edge of the runway, Edward glanced at his instrument and gazed skyward. The vibrometer's red light flickered occasionally, a small, rhythmic warning. The minutes ticked away silently. The sky appeared calm, yet something inside the machine vibrated. The thin thread of metal whispered. Edward switched to the radio. The frequency was slightly busy, and voices passed through several channels. The tower signaled, busy. Edward shifted quickly, searching for a backup channel. Falcon 9. This is ground 2, he said, his voice clear enough to penetrate the cabin. High temperature in engine 3. Reduce throttle and circle the runway. The tower returned after a brief silence. Falcon 9 cleared for takeoff. Control reports indicate no problem, Edward repeated in a broken voice. I repeat, engine anomaly. A brief hiss on the radio, then Ryan's indifferent, preoccupied voice. My data is clear. I'll let you. And the cockpit closed, and the engines shifted to a higher frequency. Edward watched with a heavy feeling in his chest. The lines in his notebook suddenly trembled. His eyes suddenly wandered off into the distance, a fragment of memory, a child's voice in a fire, a cry of pain. At that moment, Edward's fingers went blank. The notebook didn't fall to the ground. No small scream rang out from the runway level. The plane bounced sharply off the concrete and plummeted into the sky. There was a hint of mayday in that moment. The wind's language had changed. A few technicians were scurrying around the edge of the runway, the tower meticulously monitoring the frequencies. Altitude notifications were coming in. Minor deviations in the engine's shafts. Then micro warnings from inside the cabin. The alarm bells rang softly, and Ryan was staring at the cockpit lines with a narrow, telescope-like focus. Edward picked up the radio and called again. A voice, a word cut the throttle, came out, but there was a roar in the pilot's ears. Perhaps 2 more words echoed later. Already too late. The plane, slowly but surely, entered a fight against the sky. Edward was on his knees, his hands on his knees, his eyes finding a point in the sky. Listen, he told himself. Listen and don't let go. At that moment, something else happened. An attendant came running toward Edward and shouted, Mr. Haynes. Edward nodded. I'm just watching, he said. And waiting. The impending disaster and the silent hero's final mission. The sky was paler than usual that morning. The air quivered, almost like a living being breathing. As the Falcon 9 rose through the clouds, Ryan found himself immersed in a familiar silence. Only the engine's unique rhythm, the reassuring melody of metal. But within that melody, one note seemed to be playing incorrectly. He glanced at the screens. All the readings were normal. The fuel balance was stable. The temperature readings were nominal, but he felt a vague tightness in his chest. Don't be ridiculous, he said to himself. It's all in the protocol. Down below, Edward was still at the radio. The technicians standing beside him couldn't hide the tension on their faces. The small monitor in one of his hands was still blinking red. Mr. Haynes, the young technician said, authority has cleared. Engine readings are normal. Edward didn't look up. He said only one word. The numbers are sometimes late. Ryan lowered the plane into a bank. He was about to turn one more time, then complete the test maneuvers. There was an echo he couldn't identify, as if someone were whispering. A distant voice, close to his ear. Do not take off without checking engine. A static hum on the radio startled him. Then a brief crackle, followed by a moment of silence. A momentary lapse in the readings. The temperature of the third engine suddenly rose 8 degrees. Ryan frowned, tapping the control panel. Tower, Falcon 9. Engine 3 sensor may be faulty, showing a deviation. Tower, Falcon 9. Temperature readings are normal. Proceed. Ryan took a deep breath. Understood, proceed. But at that moment, Edward leaned into the radio. The tremor in his voice wasn't one of fear, but of remembrance. Falcon 9, this is Edward. Listen to me. That's not a sensor. That's metal. Ease off the throttle. There were a few seconds of silence on the radio. Ryan replied angrily, Mr. Haynes, don't interfere. Mission protocol is active. But Edward continued, the engine won't carry you, son. That engine will kill you. Ryan clenched his fist. Nobody will kill me. The fuselage vibrated slightly. A thin reflection on the cockpit window. A gray glow mixed with the golden light of the sun. Sweat poured down Ryan's forehead. The warning beep went off once, then again, and on the third, silence. A moment of peace. Then a sharp scream in the cabin. Engine 3. Failure detected. Ryan reflexively pressed the buttons. Tower, Engine 3 failed. Temperature rise out of control. Tower, Falcon 9 initiate emergency landing procedure. But the throttle remained stuck. It was as if the metal had a will of its own. Ryan's heart pounded in his ears as the cabin alarm echoed. He commanded himself, remain calm. System reboot. The screen went blank. All systems were shutting down one by one. At that moment, Edward's voice echoed again, a channel no one had seen. An old frequency, a line that hadn't been used in years. Cut the throttle. Engine reboot. Calm down, son. Breathe. Ryan was stunned. The radio wasn't on, but the voice was clear. He looked around for a moment. No one was in the cockpit, only that voice. His fingers automatically went to the throttle. He eased off the throttle. The engine coughed once. Then, silence. The plane drifted briefly. Then the balance was shattered. With the last hope, Ryan pulled the emergency ejection lever. The seat boomed, hurtling into the sky. Below, the massive metal hulk slowly tore through the clouds, plummeting to the ground. A dark flash, gray smoke, then a screaming wind. Edward dropped to his knees at the edge of the runway. He planted his hands on the ground. His eyes were fixed on the sky. The radio had stopped ringing, but he was still listening. One of the technicians shouted, "Mr. Haynes, the plane crashed." Edward didn't answer. He just whispered, "I knew it. That engine doesn't lie." The crowd rushed, ambulances activated, sirens echoed, but Edward didn't move. After a while, her breathing became heavy, and her hands began to tremble. The young technician tried to hold her back, but she said only one sentence, "I was already there," and she fell silent. At that moment, the wind above the runway died down for a moment. It was as if even the sky itself stood in silence. 3 hours later, Ryan was found by rescuers in the woods. He was injured but alive. His first question when he regained consciousness was, "Where's Edward?" No one could answer. A guard in the tower bowed his head. His heart gave out. "A few minutes after you fell, a lump formed in Ryan's throat." He couldn't utter a word. He lay silent in the hospital tent for hours. He listened to his own breathing as he stared at the ceiling. Then the words echoed in his ears. "Eliminate the throttle. Restart the engine. Calm down, son," he muttered to himself. "Who told me that? That frequency wasn't on." There was no answer. Only a slight breeze stirred the curtain. A week passed. The base was preparing incident reports. The cause of the crash was unclear. The recordings confirmed engine failure, but no technical fault had been found. The commission examined the black box. Ryan was summoned to a meeting as soon as he recovered. There were only 3 people at the table: the research director, Engineer Carter, and Ryan. The room was quiet, the lights dim. On the table sat a black box inscribed in small white letters, Falcon 9 CVR. The president pressed the button. There was a static crackle, then Ryan's own voice. "Engine failure. Out of control." Then the alarm. And another voice. "Cut the throttle. Restart the engine." "Calm down, son," Ryan gasped. He straightened in his chair. The president asked softly, "Do you recognize that voice, Captain Cole?" Ryan's voice trembled. "That's Edward's voice. But he was on the runway. How could that be?" No one could answer. The room fell silent. When the recording finished, the engineer turned off the device. The timestamp is 20 seconds before the crash. The signal came from near the runway, not from the cockpit line. Ryan silently rose from the table. He bowed his head, his eyes filled with tears. "He saved me," he whispered. No one spoke. Ryan couldn't stay at the base that night. The reports, the interrogations, the signatures, they were all mere formalities. But that voice echoing in his mind was too human for any rules to explain. A voice, it hadn't come from a frequency, but from his conscience. He couldn't sleep. As he stared at the ceiling of his room, a question kept circling. How did Edward make that voice heard? Towards morning, he went to the base's archives building. The security guard raised his head and saluted warily, but Ryan didn't answer. He asked for old maintenance records. Among the boxes were dusty folders, smudged documents, forgotten signatures. A faded name in the corner of a file caught his eye. Project 19B Chief Mechanic, Edward Haynes. He opened the file. A yellowed photograph fell out, a young pilot with Edward smiling beside him. On the back of the photo was a single word: Ethan. Ryan continued his search. According to the records, Ethan Haynes, Edward's son, had crashed during a training flight in 1984. The report said it was pilot error, but the note underneath had a small addition: warning issued, ignored. As Ryan turned the pages, the significance of Edward's silence grew. He began to understand why the men hadn't spoken for years, why he never got angry with anyone, why he would go to the edge of the runway every morning and silently gaze up at the sky. A father had failed to save his son, and with every takeoff and landing, he listened to the engine sound of that day anew. He suddenly realized that black box sound wasn't a miracle, but a man's final debt. He had delivered the warning he couldn't give his son to someone else. Perhaps his soul had finally found peace. 3 days later, special ceremony was held at the base. The ceremony was quiet, simple, yet meaningful. No one gave long speeches. Not even the military band played a single note. There was only the wind, the flag fluttering on the runway, and an empty bagpipe sitting at the edge of the runway. Ryan stepped up to the podium. His face was stern, but his eyes were different, a softness, a realization. He took a short breath and grabbed the microphone. Edward Haynes. He worked at this base for 45 years. We called him just a technician, but in reality, he was the heart of every takeoff. He listened to those engines. Because he didn't just fix them, he felt them. The crowd was silent. Even the wind had slowed. Ryan continued, I didn't listen to him. I mistook his silence for arrogance. But that silence was the voice of wisdom. He saved me even after my fall. He paused for a moment. Then he pulled a small device from his jacket pocket. It was a replica of the black box. He had secretly hidden it in his room, listening to that recording over and over. He pressed the button. Edward's voice echoed from the speaker. Cut the throttle. Restart the engine. Calm down, son. A woman sobbing echoed through the crowd. Ryan closed his eyes. The sound seemed to rise into the sky on the wind. This sound, Ryan said, isn't just mine anymore. It will live on in the conscience of everyone on this base. At the end of the ceremony, a curtain was unveiled. On the hangar door, in large letters, was written, Haynes Maintenance Hangar. Below, a small plaque. He didn't fly, but he kept others in the sky. He didn't fly, but he kept others in the sky. From that day on, Ryan changed. His voice was no longer harsh when giving orders, but clear. He no longer interrupted impatiently when someone spoke. He listened to the end. Every morning, he would go to the edge of the runway and open Edward's notebook. On the last page, he found a note. The ink was faded, but the meaning was profound. Listening is the most difficult discipline. Ryan hung that sentence on his wall in his own handwriting. Every day before a flight, he would look at that sentence, put his hand to his heart, and silently say with his eyes, I'm ready. But one morning, something happened. A newly arrived pilot, a young, ambitious, and cocky man, had knocked over Edward's old desk. Ryan saw it as he passed. Is this a museum or a base? The young man taunted. Ryan approached slowly, crouched down next to the desk, and picked up the broken notebook cover. Then he looked at the young pilot and said simply, if you fly without learning from his mistakes, you engineer your own downfall. At that moment, the base fell silent. Everyone understood that Edward was no longer just a name, but a teaching. Months passed. Ryan's career continued, but now he had a different purpose. He was searching for meaning, not rank. One day, he visited the small cemetery near the base. The gravestone bore a simple inscription, Edward Haynes. He listened. Ryan sat down next to him. He pulled a small box from his pocket. Black, plain, with a phrase engraved on it. The true voice resonates in the heart. From the box, he pulled out a flash drive. Inside was a message he had recorded in his own voice. He whispered softly, I've eased off the throttle, Edward. Now I'm restarting. The wind blew. A jet could be heard through the trees. Ryan looked up. The F-19C soared, leaving a trail in the sky. That trail was like a prayer etched into the sky, one man's silent sacrifice mingled with another's eternal gratitude. Years passed. Ryan retired, But every morning, waking up, looking in the mirror, he still heard that voice. No high ranks, no medals, no ceremonies could drown out that voice. Because that voice was not just the echo of a man, but of a conscience. It was the simple yet profound warning that everyone who has risen through life with arrogance needed to hear. Cut the gas. Restart the engine. Calm down, kid. No one had ever listened to Edward Haynes, but eventually, everyone understood. True heroism is sometimes experienced not through noise, but through silence. If a man, even before his death, can make others soar, he is a spirit of the sky. And some voices emanate not from radio waves, but from conscience. They are recorded not in black boxes, but in the hearts of people. That voice is no longer a myth. It is a reminder. Every story that begins with pride must end with humility. Some people conquer the skies, while others quietly repair wings.